Great. Well, Dean, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the time that you spent talking with many of us. I know that last night's event was quite a hit.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun.
And this is why we have so many folks here tonight. I want to ask you, what would you say has been your proudest achievement over the last year? We have a new presidency, a new administration, and a lot has changed in just 11 months.
I think what I'm proudest of, and when I say I, and it's not because I'm particularly humble, because I'm actually not that humble. But I'm honest, and when I say I mean the newsroom. I think that we have managed to cover a very difficult story under a lot of pressure and hold on to our standards. And that's difficult. We've never had a situation where we're covering an administration that openly attacks us and calls us names. And I think we have done that while keeping our head and holding on to the stuff that we care about. And I'm proud of that.
Over the course of your career, you've really had to stick to your guns on some things. What would you say is something that you would not negotiate over, that you were consistently proud of?
One act or something for the long overhaul of the long
for the greater good of journalism.
I think that for me, the story comes first, and that means sometimes not only does it mean upsetting people, sometimes it means upsetting people inside the newsroom. I can remember one great lesson when I was a young editor, and my first attempt at editing, I was after the Oklahoma City bombing. I was a reporter, and the New York Times sent me to Oklahoma City to run the coverage on the ground because they suddenly realized there were 25 reporters and photographers down there and nobody to act as a bureau chief. So I went down to run the coverage, and one night I got a call from the national editor and the deputy managing editor, and they said, "Who do you want to write the main story tonight?" And my choices were this great rewrite guy who was sitting in New York, or this guy who was not as good a rewrite person, who was sitting next to me. And I thought, this guy, he's my friend. I would like my friend to write the lead story tonight, not that guy who's actually fabulous at it. I would like my friend to do it. And it was a disaster. And I got back to New York 2 weeks later, and Joe Lelyveld, who was then the executive editor, put his arm around me. And Joe was nothing if not frank. And he said, "You did a really good job. You made one really big mistake." He said, "That night when you picked this other reporter to write the lead all, he said, you did that because he's your friend, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do me a favor. Fix the paper's problems first. Fix your problems afterward." I thought, good advice that I've tried to follow.
Oftentimes, I think as journalists, we operate in silos. We hang around with each other, we socialize with each other. We don't shine a mirror on society as well as we could. What would be your message to the students in the crowd today about going out and really becoming strong journalists?
I mean, first off, this is hard to do. It's really hard to do. And I realize as I get older, a lot of the advice I give to people is stuff that I've not always followed so well. You should try to have relationships and friendships outside of journalism. I say that as somebody who, married somebody he met in a newsroom, who's, when I envision, my pallbearers, most of them are people I've met in newsrooms. On the other hand, am I off here?
No, we're listening to all of us.
On the other hand, when I moved to Los Angeles, I got to know a guy who made horror films really well. I got to know another guy who writes novels. I think it's important to get outside your journalism relationships, and I also think it's important to travel, and I also think it's important to read, and I think it's important to try to see stuff that's outside your normal frame of reference. But more importantly, I think it's important to do it with an inquiring mind, not to go visit some place and say, well, this is interesting anthropologically. To go ask a lot of questions, shut up and listen, and just make sure you're taking stuff in that you wouldn't naturally be exposed to.
There's a term, fake news. I hear that it makes your skin crawl.
It does.
If you would tell us a little bit about why that term bothers you so much.
It bothers me because every, politician and, person accused of anything in America, the first thing they now say is, there was a moment when television shows started to use the phrase "no comment" a lot, and I was a young police reporter in New Orleans, and I walked up to a kid to do an interview on a crime scene, and he said "no comment." It was like a 12-year-old kid. Fake news is like that, right? A politician doesn't like a story, it's fake news. And I think that it's sort of created the notion and the unfair notion in people's minds that journalists are actually making stuff up, which is false. Journalists make mistakes, but journalists, as a rule, do not make stuff up. The people I respect as journalists, and also the institutions that most of you, I think, read, don't make stuff up. And so it makes my skin crawl because it's used so loosely, just as I don't like that story, therefore it's fake news, including by the President of the United States, of course.
Facts are sacred, and that's an area that we don't. Okay.
Right. And they're not only sacred, they're just facts. I can't remember who said you're entitled to, was it Daniel Patrick Moynihan? Moynihan, who said you're entitled to your opinion, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. I buy that.
Yeah. Where do you see journalism headed? It's more important than ever. We're being scrutinized like never before. What does the future look like in the next 3 years?
I actually think, and this is not, trust me, I'm not naive. I've been through more journalism storms over the years. I think this is like we're headed toward an important golden age of journalism. I think we're already in it. I think what usually happens if you read history is people never quite know when they're in a great era until, afterward, when somebody writes a book that says that was such a great era. I think this is a difficult, painful era. All of our customs and traditions are being questioned, but we're better. It is better that the New York Times and the Arizona papers can use video as well as words. That's just better. It's better that I said this last night, but that the kid who I was growing up in New Orleans, who had access to only two local papers, that same kid, if he can work his way around the internet, can read The Guardian. He can read the New York Times till he hits the paywall, but that's a lot. He can read all kinds of stuff. He can go on the website of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and if he fancies Cézanne, he can actually look at good reproductions of every Cézanne painting if he wants to. Don't get so distracted by all of the turmoil and the bad stuff and the questions. That is better. That is just better for society. It just is. It may not be better for the newspaper business, which of course makes me sad and probably makes a lot of people in this room sad. A lot of news organizations are going to have to fight for their lives, but it is better for society, and in the long run, it's better for journalism.
You keep saying New Orleans, and we were joking about that earlier. You're saying it correctly.
Thank you.
I had a jazz professor who would always say that. You look back on your life, 1 of 5 growing up, parents were trying hard to make ends meet. I was sitting here and thinking, I'm from a small border town. What am I doing sitting next to the editor of the New York Times? How important is that we have real people with real life experiences who are out here helping present the news, deliver the information that is important in our day-to-day ability to make a decision?
It's important. I mean, it's important that newsrooms are populated by people of different backgrounds and from different worlds. It's important, and again, I said this last night too, I think that the two of the biggest stories we broke this year, one was the Bill O'Reilly story and the other one was the Harvey Weinstein story. The lead reporters on both of those stories were women, were young women in the newsroom. We probably would have known about this, the fact that, now every woman I've had a conversation with has a story about sexual harassment. Well, maybe we would have written those stories, the press in general would have seen those stories 10 years ago if there had been more women in authority and in reporting jobs in newsrooms. And I think you want to have a newsroom that is varied. As far as my own background, it certainly makes me more humble. It probably makes me more questioning of authority. In general, it makes me, I don't pal around with powerful people, which always surprises people. When I ran the Washington Bureau through most of the Obama administration. I never met the president the whole time I was running the New York Times' Washington Bureau, because I didn't go to the White House Christmas party. I yanked the New York Times out of the gridiron and all those crappy things where journalists are supposed to bounce around with politicians. And so, my life was spent with my reporters, my friends, and my family. And I thought that was better.
You told me during dinner that you are required to retire at a certain age, which is...
All editors of the New York Times have to retire at 65. That's 35 years more for me? No. But nobody, you often don't go till 65. But it's true that you start to think about your career. You start to look back on your career. You start to think about what you want to leave behind. You start to think about what kind of newsroom you want to leave behind. I'm not in any rush to leave, and I'm not expecting to leave anytime soon, but I think about those things. It's important to me that I feel like the New York Times in the last year, thanks to the family, thanks to the business side, and thanks to the newsroom, has turned a corner. I think that if somebody is writing the anecdotal lead and the history of the New York Times, I think this year the last couple of years will have been really important. But I would like to sort of, make sure that the newspaper that I hand over to the next person is on really solid ground. So far it is.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to just a couple folks in the audience with any questions that we may have. Anyone have a burning question for Dean? Mr. Sotomayor. Okay.
Hi, Frank.
Hello, Dean. Dean, I'm a big fan, obviously, of the New York Times and online subscriber. A lot of us give a lot of credence to the Times reporting, its scrupulous reporting, editing. That's why when I opened up the newspaper or opened up my account on election day 2016, I saw that the Times upshot column said Hillary Clinton had an 85% chance of winning. And they also said something about, she had about as much chance of losing as an NFL player missing a 36-yard field goal. So looked like it was a sure thing.
Yeah.
And what upset me was not so much that they were wrong. Obviously, the prediction was wrong. A lot of other people and papers had it wrong. But it seems to me that when you're talking about an opinion poll, it's not a precise number. There is a margin of error.
Yeah.
There is a sampling error. And in most of the reports close to the election day, there was no mention of the margin of error. If you consider the margin of error, it really was kind of a toss-up. So I'm just wondering, are you looking at making some changes in the next election, next year in 2020?
Yeah.
Or you think that you're going to continue to let your reporters make these bold predictions? Thank you.
I think I would, that's a good question, thank you. I have two answers because there are two questions embedded in it. The first one is the very precise question of, we put on the homepage this sort of meter, and I think that's what Frank's referring to, that sort of always seemed to show Hillary Clinton in that, as you said, that 85% range. That meter we were trying to come up with a way to visualize for people all of the polls, not only our poll, but all of the sort of an aggregation of all the polls across the country. That meter was a mistake, though. I think it was oversimplistic, because I think you're right. Polls are complicated. They not only have margins of error, but they change a lot. So I think our attempt, and I've said this to the newsroom, I think our attempt to simplify it made it too simple and was misleading to people. I had when we were having one of our mea culpa sessions among the editors about that thing, one of my, Matt Purdy, who's one of the deputy managing editors, who has a great talent for coming up with a funny line when you're beating yourself up. He said, it was just like you were, your cholesterol count was on a meter, and you thought, well, I'm great, so I'm going to keep eating cheeseburgers. And then suddenly it goes like that, and you're dead. That was a mistake. It was not a mistake to try to come up with a way to make the polls easier to digest, but we came up with a way that was too simple. And it was my fault, by the way, to put it on the homepage. I don't think our coverage of the election I don't think that mistake was reflective of our overall coverage of the election. What I have said and what I sincerely believe is that I think we covered the election well. I think what we did not do as well, and I mean now the global we, all of the press, I think it would have started before the election. I don't think we had a handle on just how much turmoil and division, how much turmoil there was, and how many divisions there were in the country. It's almost as significant the fact that Donald Trump won, even though, by the way, Donald Trump, we were talking to people around Trump that night, they did not expect to win. We had sources in Mitch McConnell's camp. We had a reporter with Mitch McConnell, and they were essentially saying, we don't know how bad it's going to be, but we're going to lose. But I think that if I had to do it over again, I would have paid a lot more attention to the turmoil in the country. Turmoil that not only led to the election of Donald Trump, but caused a socialist finished second in the race for the Democratic nomination. If you take that and the election of Donald Trump, that's a sure sign that the country wanted dramatic change. And I don't think the press, in the years before the election, not just in the political context, I don't think we did a good enough job reflecting that.
Following up on this a little bit,
Speak up just a little bit.
Yeah, okay. I'm Tony Davis from the Star, Arizona Daily Star. One of the reasons that has been cited for this, rightly or wrongly, is the growing concentration of media presence on the coasts,
Yeah.
and the growing hollowing out of local newspapers across the country. 10 years ago, I think it was 1 in every 8 journalists worked in DC, New York, or LA, and now it's 1 in every 5. I guess I wondered if you perceive this as a problem, like some columnists and observers have said, and do you think anything can be done about it, either by your own organization or by the profession in general?
I think that is the greatest crisis in American journalism. The decline of local news organizations with no sense yet of what's going to take their place. I personally think, because in this, I've now worked at so many places, I have a better handle than I ever have had on the economics of news and newspapers, and I think a lot of them are going to go out of business. And I think that's a crisis. And I think we're already at the crisis point. I think that the examples abound. There are entire congressional delegations that are not covered. I don't think anybody in Mississippi, or I don't think any paper in Mississippi or television station in Mississippi or Alabama, just to name 2, have anybody covering their delegations. That's astounding. That means of the 535 members of Congress who make, life and death decisions, many of them are never written about, many of them are never covered. I think that the New York Times is going to be fine. I think, in fact, the New York Times is going to thrive. I think local news is in trouble. I think it's the financial model, which is dependence on advertising, is eroding. I mean, when I started in the business, your typical news organization got 80% of its revenue from advertising. You know, our revenue is like close to being 50-50 between circulation now and audience and advertising, and it's the audience stuff that's growing. I think too many news organizations either first cut so much that it's hard for them to make the case for people to pay a lot of money for them, or secondly, they're in communities where people just can't afford to pay enough to sustain them. What I think is going to happen is I think there are going to be a lot of smaller news organizations that are born online that will take up some of the slack. I think there's going to be a lot more sort of targeted websites. I think that there are just a lot of creative people, a lot of them in this room, who are going to come up with ideas that we wouldn't even have imagined to cover slices of news, and people are going to have to just sort of aggregate their own news a little bit. I mean, I'm confident that it's going to work out. I worry about investigative reporting because it's really expensive, and it's hard to support. I worry about nitty-gritty, sometimes boring coverage of government. I worry who's going to cover school boards in the suburbs. That's what scares me the most about journalism. Did I ruin your evening? The dessert's really good.
Another question? Over here. All right. Phil Donahue, on the way.
If you want to answer anything, you should.
That's a reference.
Oh, I don't have a microphone anymore. We're okay.
Generation of our students.
I caught the reference, that's okay. Would you comment on the current discussion about identifying social media companies such as Facebook as really being legitimate media and should be subject to the same type of scrutiny as press, cable, and television?
I do think, I'm always a little anxious about, I will say, in principle, about more regulation for media, just because, you know, one day somebody might think it's a great idea to regulate us, and I don't think that's a good idea. But I do think that Facebook and social media are starting to realize, they used to be in sort of complete denial, and I think what their analogy would have been, we're just the newspaper stand. We're not the creators of content. We're just the places where people go for stuff. And I think the combination of this election and the fact that there's so much of struggle from other media, I think they're finally starting to face up to the fact that they're a lot more than that, and I think that's really good. We have a different relationship with them only because we charge. We just keep a little more distance from them than other news organizations because we don't want people getting all of their New York Times content on Facebook. We want them to pay for it. But I think you're going to see changes in the way they behave. They're already trying because they understand they're not just a newsstand. There's something more than that.
Okay, question over here. Matt, one of our stellar grad students.
Hi, so grad student. And so as a grad student, I spend a lot of time reading, writing, and then things will go on in the news, and I'll look at it, and I'll have like no idea what happened as far as like the background and what's been going on, because I've just been reading everything else for the last couple of weeks. But also, talking to the people around the city, it's things are going on in the news, right? So we see some of the Times, we just don't have the context to put it into. So what tools does the Times have with all this new information available to people that previously didn't have that background? What tools is the Times developing to allow people to kind of get that background information that they need?
A lot. A lot. I mean, one of the, I can't tell you how much of my own, one of the things I often say to people around me in the newsroom is that one of the hardest things about being an editor today, while you're trying to make lots of changes, is understanding the difference between mission and custom. Mission are the things you hold on to because they really are your values. Custom are the things you just started to do 50 years ago and nobody remembers that they were done for, reasons that don't matter anymore. I think we always had the assumption that if you're reading the New York Times, you understand, what's going on in Syria, and you understand, the background between why people accuse China of being in a trade war with the United States, and that we don't have to explain that stuff to you. If you're smart enough to pay all this money for the New York Times, well, that was wrong. We've started a column called The Interpreter that runs, which two people work on it, and they produce a couple times a week a story where we ask them to confront just a simple question. Just explain something to people. We are much better, especially online, at catching our breath and saying, here's how the healthcare bill would actually affect you. We're much better, I think, at we're not perfect, I don't mean that, but we're much better at understanding that sometimes we have to hold people's hands a little bit, and that, in fact, is part of the mission. We're much better at video explainers. I think we now automatically, there's like editors in the room who automatically, 10 years ago, nobody in the New York Times newsroom would be afraid to say, I actually don't understand this, because we were all supposed to be really smart. I think people say that now, and that's a good question, and we try to answer it. We're working much harder at that. I would implore all news organizations to do that. One of my mentors, John Carroll, was the editor of the Lexington, the late John Carroll, who was my boss at the LA Times. When he took over the Lexington paper, they did, I can't remember how these academic studies work, to see what the reading level, what kind of reading level you had to have to read the Lexington paper. And he was shocked. You had to have a reading level that was higher than the reading level of Lexington, which did not have a highly educated populace. And he did something about it. He got rid of the $25 words and just tried to make it more. That's part of our mission. It's to explain stuff too.
Did you ever finish your degree? I
No.
meant to ask you. Okay.
Never did. I'm a complete dropout.
Okay. I wanted to ask Dean, because I read this, and now that you brought it up, it's fair game. You dropped out of Columbia?
Yes.
Professor Schmidt over here trying to encourage you to enroll,
He's
maybe?
frowning. I never got my degree, and I would not recommend that to anybody else. But I never
Okay.
got my degree. Don't do that.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, another question. Over here, oh, all right.
Wow.
And welcome, we
That's
have some
awesome.
very high-powered First Amendment lawyers in the house.
Uh-oh.
All the way from DC, Colorado, and even Phoenix.
So, I'm not going to say this is necessarily my view, but I've heard people say that Mr. Trump is a master manipulator of the press, that he's quite expert at directing the public discussion. So on the Saturday after Jeff Sessions, he rebukes Jeff Sessions for recusing himself supposedly from any further involvement in Russian matters. He tweets that the former president tapped his phone and we're no longer talking about Jeff Sessions. And after rebuke and criticism for failure to respond to Puerto Rico, he tweets that athletes shouldn't take a knee and that NFL should throw these people out, and now we're talking about the NFL. To what extent has the New York Times talked about not allowing Mr. Trump's tweets to drive the news discussion?
That's a good question. That's a question I get all the time. I think we have to cover his tweets. I mean, he's the president of the United States. The things he says matter, and they're news. And I can't think of anything more sort of oddly arrogant than if I were to wake up one morning and he tweeted, obviously if he tweeted what he watched on television last night, that's different. But I can't think of anything more oddly arrogant if I woke up tomorrow morning and he had tweeted a new comment about immigration, for instance, and I were to call the news desk and say, you know, I'm tired of this guy. Don't write about that. I think that's really dangerous. Yes, I do think he tries to change the subject in the media. There's no question. I think he struggles with the media he has to deal with now. I mean, he grew up in the world of New York tabloids, which is a world of sort of trading information, mostly gossip, you know, sort of friendships, dinners, stuff that wasn't important. I mean, he famously, you know, one of his wives found out he wanted to break up in a gossip column. You know, he's, but this is a different game, and I think that he probably struggles with it a little bit. He doesn't fully change the subject. I mean, it's not like if he tweets tomorrow about something else, people will stop writing about healthcare. I think they do. I think this is a different animal. But I think it would be almost unjournalistic and arrogant to not cover his tweets. His tweets that are about policy and meaningful stuff.
Good question. Oh, Eric. Get used to this. We're going to cover legislature.
So I'm the vice president of the U of A's Online News Association, and one of the things that we're working on this year is Twitter bots, and how Twitter bots and automation kind of can bring out all sorts of information and be really useful or really harmful, as it was found to be in this last election. So with automation becoming more and more commonplace in a variety of different fields, journalism being one of them, where do you see that going in the future? Where do you see the New York Times using Twitter bots and other forms of automation to help in its reporting of journalism?
I see the New York Times and everybody else using automation. I'm not sure I'm knowledgeable enough to talk about what I see the future of Twitter bots. I think automation. I mean, I can think of a lot of. Can I broaden it to a little bit more broadly, different kinds of technology? I think that whether it's AR or VR, I think those are all going to be great for journalism. I think that those things are going to make journalism more visual, more exciting, and more present. And my general rule is that I don't think we should say no to anything, any new technology and the possibilities of any new technology, because my experience so far is that by and large they've been good for us, even if it takes us a long time to figure them out. So my general rule is I think we should try stuff.
Good question. Over here, I'll be right over here. By the way, I have to say, I'm not sure we ever had a guest come to our school who spent most of yesterday in classes talking to literally 220 students he talked to.
I'm trying to make up for the time I wasn't in class in college. I think I have another 10 years to catch up. So.
Get you an honorary degree.
Hi, my name's Jeff Owen. There's two events that occurred recently, and I'm wondering what the thinking in the future is for the New York Times. One is Brexit. All of the experts, all of the lawyers who know it, said Brexit would never happen.
Right. Sounds familiar, right?
So people were told cast protest votes. They didn't show up on the voters. One thing or another, and of course Brexit went through. Narrow margin went through. A few months later, we've got their presidential election. All the experts, all the polls, Hillary's going to win. So a lot of Democrats didn't show up. Or they decided to cast a protest vote. This was rude. It was a certainty. And so it didn't happen. Hillary didn't win. So what now do you think when you report? I mean, are you relying on polls?
Yeah.
those that are so overall.
First off, I'm not sure this was a failure of polling in general. I think, as I described before, I think it may have been a failure of relying too much on polls. It may have been a failure on trying to oversimplify polls. But she actually did get more votes than he did. So I'm not sure all the polls were wrong. I do. So I guess what I would say is, if I had to walk away from both experiences with a lesson, it's that you can't rely just on polls. We have to redouble our efforts to be out in the country, in the case of the presidential election, and similarly in the case of covering Brexit, because we do have a few dozen people in Europe. I think we have to be better at being places, talking to people. It's what I said earlier. I will say, I don't buy that the coverage of this campaign is the reason Donald Trump won. I don't really buy that. I think that carries with it, I know you're not necessarily saying that, but people often do. I think that carries with it, I think there's a danger in thinking that. It keeps you from really trying to understand why the country wanted to make so much change last year. I think if you easily grab hold of the explanation that, well, you know, it was the press's fault, or it was somebody else's fault, or Hillary Clinton didn't run a good campaign, or, you know, whatever. First off, trust me, the press was tough on Donald Trump. I mean, we certainly were. But I think in the end, people wanted a change. Enough people wanted a change to vote for Bernie Sanders and vote for Donald Trump. And if we let ourselves go for easy answers, we're going to keep ourselves from trying to understand that phenomenon. And that phenomenon is historic and more compelling to me.
I met someone the other day who had a theory, and bear with me because I'm trying to remember this, but he said that Abraham Lincoln was the newspaper president, President Roosevelt was the radio, President Kennedy, TV, President Obama, social media, President Trump, reality TV. What do you think of that theory, and goodness, what is coming next as far as the media? What does that say about society and the role of the media?
You know, I think that I just read a very smart piece by a guy named Sam Tannenhouse, who used to work with me at the Times, who advances that theory too. Oh,
whoa!
Is this better? I'll share this with you.
Okay.
I just read a piece by a very thoughtful journalist named Sam Tannenhouse, who also called Trump the reality show president. I guess I think that our desire to simplify what happened, and I think our desire to sort of put a label on what happened is going to keep us from really thinking hard about what happened. Donald Trump won, I suspect, for a lot of reasons. One of them was that the country really, really wanted a change after years of fighting between the Republicans and Democrats. Another reason was I think people were really angry at the way money and economics and wealth is divided in the country. And I think people saw no movement by anybody in power to do anything about it. I think the Republican candidates were really boring in retrospect. But there are 20 reasons why. And I guess I just worry about labeling him too much, or something really historic and compelling happened, and I don't think we fully understand it. And my goal is to spend the next couple of years, asking reporters to go places so that for the next election I understand it. I understand the things I wish I'd done differently. I understand the meter. I don't think Donald Trump won because of our meter, but I don't want to use the meter again. I want to understand this election and what happened and why something remarkable happened, and I want to resist sort of simple answers, because the answers are never that simple.
Okay. Dave?
We have several questions back here. Some really good ones here.
Uh-oh.
Good evening and congratulations. My question is, so apparently everybody expected Hillary to win at some point, but now that we have Trump running the administration, what do you think would have changed in media if Hillary won? And how do you see the future of journalism and reporting changing? Thank you.
So how do you think the media would be different if Hillary Clinton had won? Boy, that's a good question. I think that it would have been a lot less interesting. I'm just talking about as a story. I'm not making a value judgment on which would have been better for the country. Look, this is really interesting. He is trying to make some historic changes in government and failing, but he is also making some historic changes in government that people aren't paying enough attention to. I mean, the regulatory structure of the country is changing significantly. The role generals play in making command decisions is different today than it was. I think Hillary Clinton would have been a very compelling president, the first woman president. I think it would have raised all kinds of interesting questions for society. But I also think she probably would have been a very traditional centrist Democratic president, like most of her predecessors. I'm not making a judgment about that. I just think that would have been the case. We knew what she was going to be like. We knew what she believed. She'd been in the Senate, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it would have been less interesting. That's not a value judgment. That's just a fact. Was there a second part to the question too? Or did I?
The second part is, how do you see the future of journalism and reporting changing?
How do I see the future of journalism? I mean, I think I touched on some of that. I mean, I think the future of journalism is, I think really bright. It's going to be different, and you got to get ready for different, and you gotta like hold on to your hat, and you have to understand that it's not going to look like it looks now, and you got to accept that some of the things that you thought were vital to journalism 50 years ago just are not today. And if you're wistful about what we had 50 years ago, you're doomed. In any field, by the way, right? Even in professional sports, it's changing. And if there's any profession that should embrace change, even though we can be conservative, it's journalism, because we are like supposed to be the people who reflect the changes in society.
Good question. Sarah Gasson, opinion editor from the Arizona Data Star, one of our agents.
This is for you.
I have a question, a practical question for a lot of the students in the audience, new to journalism, going to be graduates coming out into the field. We would all like to just pop up at the New York Times and say, hi, here I am, please cover me, but I don't think it works.
You want my email address?
Yes. So what practical, real-world advice do you have for people just starting out? We're going into these newsrooms that are changing, that are local, that are somewhat in peril, as you said.
Yeah.
So what practical advice do you have, career step-wise, to get to where you are today?
Yeah. First, do it.
Stay in school first.
Finish school. First, do it. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Do it. It's an amazing profession. The life I have had in journalism, given where I started, is just unimaginable. That's the first thing. You have to learn more skills. I had two skills. I could write, and I could get people to talk to me. You're going to have, the journalist of the future is going to have to be comfortable with technology. I think the foreign correspondent of the future is not just going to be a writer. I think she's going to be able to do video, take photographs, develop her own audience, use whatever social media exists X years from now I think it's to have a whole range of skills. I actually think this is an important moment for journalism schools. If you'd asked me 30 years ago whether I thought going to journalism school was important, I might have said, maybe not so much, just take a job. Now I think it's important because I think there are skills to be learned in journalism school that are important. And then I would, so learn all kinds of stuff. And then the second thing I would say is read a lot. I mean, you're going to be in it for the long haul. Read history, read literature, understand the world, understand that there is nothing new. Every tumultuous time just looks like another tumultuous time from 25, 30 years ago. I think I said last night, now I can't remember whether I said it last night or in one of the classes, I heard somebody say, this is the most divided the country has ever been. And my answer is, did you ever hear that thing called the Civil War? You know, the history repeats itself, so understand history, but mainly adopt all of these skills and don't drop out of college.
Okay.
Okay, great. They're lining up. I got David Pujo from National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and I'm Carol Schwab, and I'm David Bodney, and then there are others. Jim Acosta wanted to ask a question. I said, no, out of here.
Okay, hi. I just want to ask, what should newsrooms be doing to better diversify their staff and represent the voices of marginalized people and minorities?
Did everybody hear the question? The question was, what can newsrooms do to better diversify their staffs? I think that's on, a lot of that is on people like me. I have, you know, one thing, I just made a bunch of personnel changes in the newsroom to allow me to make a lot of hires, because I thought we were sort of stuck in place in terms of hiring. And a third of the hires we've made are journalists of color. And I think that my goal is to increase the diversity of the New York Times newsroom. That includes journalists of color. I also have gone out recently and tried to hire military veterans because so many Americans now have never served in the military, and I think I was worried that there were voices missing from the newsroom and from the discussions of coverage. I think it's on people like me to make those hires, and it's on the journalism schools to make sure that they're diverse too.
Good question. Carol Schwalbe, our professor of science journalism, who worked at National Geographic. Professor Schwalbe.
Thank you. Hi. I was wondering if you could tell us what went into the decision to lay off the Times copy editors, and also who is performing that function now.
Sure. Everybody here, the question was, well, I'll tell you the background. A few months ago, I announced that I said that I thought the New York Times was over-edited, that we had an editing structure that was built for the purely print era. And by the way, every executive editor that I have known at the New York Times has written a memo saying we're over-edited, because we were. Too many people touched stories, too many people looked at stories. We have a setup called, there's a backfield where the people work most closely with reporters, and then there's the copy desk. And there were stories, at the worst of it, when I was running the Washington Bureau, I'd edit a modest story, send it to the foreign desk because it was about Afghanistan policy. I think of myself as a pretty good editor. Somebody else would then edit it again, and then it would move. That was before it got to the copy desk. I thought that was impossible to sustain in a digital age where speed is important. I also thought that that kind of editing hurt some good writing. I thought it took some young writers and made them lose confidence, and I just thought it was too much. And I've worked at 5 or 6 newspapers, and nobody edited as much as we do. I also thought that I really needed a way to hire a lot of people, because the way newsrooms hire now, even the New York Times, which everybody thinks we're, flush, we also do more stuff. We hadn't hired a new critic in like 10 years. whenever I wanted to make 2 hires for the business desk, I'd have to like steal somebody from Metro and steal somebody from someplace else. And the percentage of reporters at the paper over a decade was declining. And part of it was because I think nobody wanted to touch the editing infrastructure because it was like putting your finger on a third rail. So I decided to announce that we were completely redoing the way we edit the paper. We were going to have one less layer. Didn't mean we weren't going to have copy editing. We still have copy editing. But we were going to have one less layer. I announced a buyout for copy editors, and the understanding was I was not trying to cut. I announced a buyout for editors, period. Changed the system, ended the division between copy editors and backfielders, and just made it so that stories got 2 looks as opposed to 4 or 5, which slowed us down. I thought was too many. Some close to 100 people decided that they liked the old system, which I thought was unsustainable. That freed up 100 jobs. This was not a cost-cutting measure. This was a way of just changing a staff in an era where it had to be different. And I've been using the 100 hires to hire more reporters, more digital journalists, more visual journalists, because I think that that's the kind of newsroom the New York Times has to keep building for the future. But we still edit, we still copy edit, we just don't do it 2 or 3 times.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Give or take here. David Bodney, attorney for the Arizona Republic and any other highly revered nationally. David?
And thank you, Mr. Baquet, for spending your evening with us here tonight.
Thank you.
We're very grateful.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, thank you for spending your evening here with us tonight. We're very grateful. My question goes to your thoughts about the future of investigative and long-form journalism. And I'm struck by a possible paradox, or at least a challenge, that you identified when you spoke about the temptation to seize on simple explanations for things, like the 2016 election. And with that temptation to seize on the simple answer, how do you face the challenge associated with the time and expense it takes to drill deeply into stories?
Yeah.
It's a pressure, I think, that we sense in papers and publications around the country. How do you, maybe the New York Times is just sui generis. It plays a role in the world of long-form investigative reporting, but what are your thoughts on the future of those 2 forms of journalism?
I think the news organizations that walk away from investigative reporting and long-form journalism are going to kill themselves. I can tell you, when we do Harvey Weinstein or another kind of investigative story, even complex stories like the way the government is regulated, we get huge audiences for them. We work really hard to take advantage of every digital possibility to make the story clear and simple, and to make sure that we just tell the story in the best possible way. But I think we ran last Sunday, I'm trying to remember whether that story on the front page by Farrah Stockman was either 8,000 words or 10,000 words. I think people read that. I think that you have to give people stuff other than that, but I think people read, I know our readers do, they read long stories, and investigative stories matter. Investigative stories are why we're now having a realization about how much sexual harassment is an issue in American life, in American business and media, etc. I think it's really important. If I were running a smaller paper, I would cordon off a small number of investigative reporters, and I would protect them, and I would make sure they got to do it, because I think that, first off, I think it's the ultimate form of the mission, right? If the mission of journalism is to enlighten and ask hard questions investigative journalism and interpretive and explanatory journalism is at the height of that. And I think if you don't do it, I promise you, you're not going to make it. I think it's just vital. I also think that it's part, when I keep saying mission, we have a contract with society, right? We have our own amendment to the Constitution. Every government feels compelled to give us a press room. We get angry when the politicians or businessmen don't answer our questions. That is a remarkable amount of freedom and cachet and a remarkable, gift from the society. And I think if you don't use that to ask hard questions, you squander it. So.
Well, building on that, this is a question I haven't heard anybody ask today or yesterday. What about coverage of the world and our understanding of what's happening around the globe? That's one of our specialties.
Yeah.
What's the state of it, and what's the New York Times doing about it? What's its future?
Well, I always feel like, sometimes I feel having worked at smaller regional and local newspapers for as much of my career, more than I've worked at the New York Times, I always feel like the rich kid when people say, what about the future of foreign news? And I say, well, we actually have a lot of foreign bureaus. We have more foreign bureaus than we ever have. I think that my own view is that it's too late for a lot of news organizations that have cut their foreign staffs to ever revive them. I think the days when I started, when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had half a dozen foreign bureaus, and the Chicago Tribune had like 10 or 12. I think unfortunately those days are gone. On the other hand, I do think that people now have access to actual foreign institutions. I mean, you can read I'm not saying this is the perfect trade-off. You can read The Guardian, you can read other publications around the world. And by the way, in the era we're in now, you can read the New York Times and the Washington Post and their foreign coverage. There is no lack of foreign coverage. There's a lack of multiple voices covering foreign news. I think it's unfortunate. I don't think that you're going to see that restored in American newspapers. That would surprise me, unfortunately.
We can't end on that note. It has to be something upbeat. So give us something to end the night with that is exciting and inspiring about the future of journalism.
I said this before, but I keep saying it because I once had an editor who said, repetition is important. I often talk to people who bemoan the changes in journalism, and I might even have felt that way 5 years ago. But the epiphany for me was the coverage, the New York Times' coverage for me in my newsroom of the Ebola crisis a few years ago. And one day I walked into the video staff's office, and they showed me 2 videos they were about to put up. One video was a scene of a parents, this husband and wife, trying to get their child into a hospital, a makeshift hospital that the Americans had set up. And he was writhing on the ground in agony. And his parents were crying, and the person at the door, the poor person at the door, was just saying there's just no more beds. And I looked at that, and beyond the tragedy and the obvious sadness I felt, I thought, I now edit a publication that can put that online next to long stories. I just think that you will blow it as readers, as academics, and as future journalists if you fail to see that this revolution we're in journalism, if you fail to see that it is a good thing. It is an amazingly good thing. It gives people access to more news than they ever could have imagined. It blends different ways of storytelling under one umbrella in a way that could not have been imagined. It makes news more visual. The smartest news organizations, the ones that will survive, understand that they can't be arrogant anymore and they have to be transparent and let you in. what you're seeing now will be covered years from now as a time of great upheaval, but as I think that we're in the middle of something big and good, and I think you should sort of let go of some of your fear of losing tradition and embrace it because it's great. Thank you.